All right, so we were finishing up chapter 5, which was the argument from design. So since it's been so long, without looking, what's the argument for design?
Design is so complex.
No. I want the argument as it's stated in the book. Like
I have no idea.
premise 1, premise 2, premise 3.
Oh.
The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either, there are 3 things. It's got to be either
Necessity,
Chance,
necessity,
or
design. The fine-tuning of the universe is not due to chance or necessity, therefore due to design, right? So that's the argument. And again, remember the point of what he's doing in this book is he's doing an end run around everything, right? So the whole evolution debate and all that sort of stuff, he's just saying like from what we know, there has to be a beginning of everything. And remember, there's 2 lines of thinking on this, right? One was philosophical. What's the philosophical line of thinking on? Like what's the philosophical reason there has to be a beginning of everything, the universe?
Is that the one where the universe is getting bigger, so it has to?
No, that's a scientific one. So even if you didn't know all that, because that's the second one was, remember we said that like because of the discoveries in science that we know that the universe is expanding, so therefore if we were to essentially just reverse it, that the universe would essentially collapse down to nothing. So that we know that there has to be a beginning of the space-time universe. And remember they said that any universe that's expanding can't be infinite in the past. It has to have a beginning. And so, that's such a real thing. It's such a real problem. Like, I don't want to diminish that. Like, we have to understand it's such a real problem that the people who don't want to acknowledge that it has a beginning have come up with what's their solution to the problem. Let me just say it like that.
we just don't know.
No.
We know.
Seeing how if you guys pay attention and it stuck it all. They say, well, it's not surprising that we're here because there must
be multiple universes.
there's a multiverse, right?
Yeah.
So there's an infinite number of universes, and therefore the design thing's not a problem because we shouldn't be surprised if given an infinite number of universes, we find ourselves in the life permitting one. So, but again, is there any reason to think that there's a multiverse other than the problem of design? No, there's not. Is there any way that we can test that or trace that? Or, I mean, we can't even get outside our solar system, right? Our solar system, the Milky Way, is 100,000 light years in diameter. There's billions of galaxies, right? Like, how are we going to be like, well, there must be another universe? Like, the scale of this stuff is so big, it's hard to even like wrap your brain around it, right? So that's the scientific argument of it. But remember, there's a philosophical part of it too. So even if you didn't know any of that stuff, which most of this stuff's just been discovered in the last 100 years, which again, I think it's good to point out that it's become very popular to say that science is making this book obsolete and disproving this. Oh no, quite the contrary. It's causing a lot of things that they thought was a settled issue to be like, ooh, wait, that's a little bit more complicated than we thought, right? And it's like, now we have such a problem that we have to start talking about a multiverse. And what's the other problem, by the way, with the multiverse? Besides, there's no evidence for it.
What created the multiverse?
Well, the multiverse itself would require even more fine-tuning. Right?
And the same laws would apply.
And you have all the same problems with the universe with the multiverse. Like, where did that come from? How do you get? So it doesn't solve any problem. The philosophical part of it was the time issue. Remember, if you can't count from 0 to infinity, then how did we count down from infinity to today? If there was an infinite past before today, then how did we get here today? Right? There has to be a beginning of time for us to be here today. That's the argument. Remember we talked about all that stuff? All right. So that's that. Now, I don't want to just do an end run around the evolution thing because, again, I feel like the more, like, here's my take on this. if you go to get a job in a university and you tell them that you believe in intelligent design or you're like a literal Bible believing Christian, how's that going to go for you? No, they're not. Like, you're not going to get tenured or whatever. In fact, Michael Behe, Dr. Michael Behe, who's one of the big names of this stuff, like I got him to be on my doctoral dissertation committee. And so I sat in his office and we talked about some stuff. And when he started teaching at the university, he was an evolutionist. And then he read some books and he was like, wait a minute, something's not quite right with this. He still would call himself an evolutionist, but he challenges the whole process by which this system can operate. And he's saying, like, there's irreducibly complex things that you can't, like, there's no way to evolve these things piece by piece. They have to all be present at the same time or the whole organism dies, right? And if you read his book, he talks about things like blood clotting. So, I mean, we take that for granted, but if you cut yourself, that's got to clot or you'll bleed out. So what has to happen is your body recognizes, oh no, there's a cut here, we have to stop this. So that causes some chemical reactions that then come in and then it clots it, but then it has to know to stop clotting it too, right? Because if it just keeps clotting, you'll stroke out or have a heart attack and die, right? So he gives a whole bunch, that's just one example, and people have tried to discredit this sort of stuff, but like he gives all these examples of things in nature that they have to all be there at the same time or it doesn't work. So how do you piece by piece get to this, right? So, and he just wrote another book. Oftentimes you'll hear about, like, with vaccines and viruses and things like that, how things evolve, like bacteria evolve, and now there's antibiotic resistant bacteria, you know, and they'll say like it's evolved and things like that. Well, like MRSA, you know, people get like staph infections that they can't, it's a big deal, right? If you go to get surgery and stuff, like they have to make sure that all that stuff's scrubbed and cleaned, because if you get one of those infections and you can't treat it without antibiotics, you could die, right? Yeah. So they'll say like, see, what's happened is they've evolved. I was driving, I didn't say anything to you, but this is what I was thinking. I was driving Noah home and I was looking out at the cornfields. And if you notice the cornfields, that there's no weeds, right? And if you look at my corn patch, there's tons of weeds. You know why that is?
Chemicals, they spray chemicals.
Yeah, and so the corn that they use has been modified so that it's resistant to like Roundup, right? So that they can spray everything with Roundup, but the corn will still grow because it doesn't affect that, but it kills everything else. But what you'll notice if you go out and drive around now is there's more and more, every year I see more and more weeds because there's more and more of these Roundup resistant plants. Now, what happened? Should they just evolve? No, you've eliminated all of the competition. And so the only things that aren't affected by Roundup now have free reign to just spread out and reproduce everywhere else. Whereas if those other plants were there, they wouldn't be so prolific. You know, see what I'm saying? So a lot of that is true with all these other things that they say, like, here's a good example of evolution and at work, but it's like, oh, no, not really. Right? There's still big problems. What I want to show you before we get to the sixth chapter, which is really, I think, the most practically applicable chapter for us.
That was the fifth chapter.
We're still in the fifth chapter. I
No,
said,
but you said the sixth chapter is the most practical.
yeah, the sixth one is, I think. Because again, like when you get to, like when you're sitting in the lunchroom with your friends, like how often does the beginning of the universe come up in conversation?
I just think about this.
Sometimes it does.
Sometimes it does, but
Out of the spur of the moment.
well, it actually does, because I've had those conversations with
Yeah, no, it does come up.
But the next one is about morality, which is an easier topic to jump onto the table with.
I
Right?
like some of the videos that you sent me when I was doing my abortion paper.
Yeah, like, is there such a thing as good, bad, right, or wrong? Does
Yeah.
it even exist? And all
Yep.
that. So that's what we're getting to. But before we do that, I do want to talk about the biological evolution thing. In my estimation, perhaps even the biggest problem with evolution, like, because I think there's all kinds of issues with the process of evolution from a scientific point of view. Like, they just assume, like, oh, it just transitioned. Like, oh, big problems with that. But even that aside, how do you go from non-living, how do you go from inorganic to organic? that you read in your science books about what the guy Miller or something. Remember, he's doing some experiment in his lab, and he hit it with electrodes to simulate the primordial soup and getting struck by lightning, and it created some amino acids. And he's like, "Oh, that must be how it happened." Are you familiar with that?
No, might have heard it in the science class, but forgot about it.
Right. They have no clue how it happened. And in fact, it's, again, I don't want to, there's a guy named James Tour. I'll let him do the talking on this. But again, there's a lot of this stuff on the internet that you can find. Go on YouTube and look up James Tour. He has a lot of good talks. The guy I showed you last week, or not last week, whenever we were here last, Stephen Meyer, is really good at a lot of this sort of stuff. Oh, I have to share my screen too, don't I?
The life we have.
Come on.
As on Earth must have spontaneously generated itself.
Scientists have reason to think that the first living cells on Earth came about through a natural process called chemical evolution. First living cell chemical evolution.
Spontaneously generated itself.
Did life really spontaneously generate itself from chemicals? Has science shown this? We tracked down James Tour, one of the world's leading experts in synthetic organic chemistry, to find out.
All of these little pictures of molecules coming together to form the first cell are fallacious, are ridiculous. The origin of life community has not been honest. They will write in their very papers, they will see some small phenomenon and extrapolate what this means in the context of origin of life. And then they will work with the press, and the press will extrapolate it all the more. And you get many, many people deceived, thinking that life has been all but made. All of this is a lie.
Scientist Craig Venter creates life for the first time in a laboratory.
We're here today to announce the first synthetic cell.
We haven't created life, nowhere close. What they did is they took a cell. They took the genome out of that cell. They manufactured a genome that's similar to it, and they put it in. That is akin to taking an engine out of a Ford and putting it into a Buick and then saying, look, I created automobiles. No, you just took one piece, and it's not even the engine, it's just the computer control box you took out of one car and put it in another car. That's what it was like. But the design of the computer control box you got from other cells.
Other scientists say they've been able to create protocells in the lab that are the stepping stones to the first life.
I can mix some chemicals together in a test tube in my lab, and these chemicals will start to self-dissociate to form larger and larger structures. The protocell moves as a metabolism. It can use energy and moves around.
Protocells are a bunch of nonsense. That is like a proto-turkey. I take 20 pounds of sliced turkey meat from a delicatessen. I throw that into a pot. I add some turkey broth. I warm that up, and I throw in some feathers, and I say, that's a proto-turkey. Yeah, there's no order to it, but you know, if you wait long enough, a turkey will come gobbling out. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? That's precisely what origin of life researchers have done when they make a protocell.
Wait a second. Haven't we been taught with hundreds of millions of years anything is possible?
Time is actually the enemy. You let these chemicals that have been made sit around. They show the degradation in a period of weeks. Weeks is the twinkling of an eye when it comes to prebiotic timescales. The chemicals decompose. So to think that the molecules could be made and sit there waiting for other molecules to come in. It doesn't happen. Organic chemistry doesn't work that way.
Well, if life didn't spontaneously generate on Earth, what about scientists who believe that life must have come here from outer space?
Whether you want to have it originate from Earth or from some other planet, you have to have the origin of life. You have to have the origin of that first cell. How does that happen? We have no idea.
So with all the advances in scientific research and the study of life, why can't we figure this out?
With all of origin of life research going on, the problem is becoming harder all the time, not easier. And the reason it's become harder is because we understand more about the complexity of a cell.
To help explain the complexity of living cells, we turn to molecular biologist Douglas Axe.
To get an idea of the complexity of a living cell, think of a factory with thousands of pieces of machinery all working together to do some coordinated task. A cell is actually far more complicated than that factory because factories don't maintain themselves. People have to maintain factories, and factories certainly don't make new factories. Whereas with a living cell, all the parts that wear out are automatically remanufactured within the cell. Not only that, the cell is manufacturing a new cell as well. Human-made factories don't even come close.
For a living cell to exist and perform such complex tasks, it takes some very detailed instructions, which are chemically encoded in our DNA.
If you have a string of nucleic acids like DNA or RNA has, you have to have a precise sequence because that translates to what proteins are needed to build the organism. That's called the information code.
But where did all that information, these detailed instructions, come from to build the first cell?
We don't have a tool to assess that within chemistry.
Laboratory chemistry may not, but Stephen Meyer is convinced origin science does have the tools.
Is there anything we know of that does have the causal power, the ability to generate new information, and therefore could explain the origin of the first cell? And I think there is, and that's the idea of intelligent design.
Intelligent design is defined as the theory that certain features of the natural world are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process.
Because what we know from our experience is that intelligent agents can produce information, and indeed do produce information in a digital or typographic form, the form of information that we find in the DNA molecule, functional digital information. Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, whether we find it in a section of software code or a paragraph in a book or in a hieroglyphic inscription, we always find that a mind played a role in generating that information.
Don't be fooled by the hype. Materialists are further from explaining the origin of life than ever before, yet they still refuse to consider the only observable source known to create information code, an intelligent designing mind. We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience its love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.
I don't know what's up with the creepy masks.
You, the
That was
hacker.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the
Whatever.
actor mask. It's like he's doing it neutral.
Can I drop this down?
Just minimize it. It feels
All right, so I'm going to just show you that, like, again, for all the arguments in this book as we go to the next. Actually, does anybody have anything else about the design stuff that you want to talk about? Again, this is just the city bus tour version of things, right? We're just passing by. It goes much beyond this, but this is just kind of like, here are areas where you could do further study, but just so you're aware. All right, so we're getting into the moral thing, which again is fascinating.
Can you be good without God?
Right.
just full screen it and it'll automatically come up.
Let's find out.
Right.
Absolutely astounding. There you have it. undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But what mate? The question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object.
Remember all this stuff?
So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
So just to pause and think about this. If I asked you to define good, what would you say? What is good?
Like in the video, you can't really do that unless there's some sort of standard.
Right. Think about that. So that's the problem. When people want to deny God and deny any, I mean, there's a lot of people who are not believers in God or atheists, whoever, who still want to have objective morality. They'll say, oh yeah, I believe in objective morality. But the problem is what?
There's no standard.
Where are you getting the objective morality from? Like, where does your standard come from? Because again, by definition, if there is no transcendent, perfect source, like moral law giver, then where do you get the moral law from?
Yourself, which is subjective
Which
morality.
is by definition subjective, right? But then there's some people who will say, well, there's something called moral Platonism. And they'll say, well, you know, like gravity, morality just exists somewhere. But even if you grant that, which I don't think is true for a second, but even if you granted that, the problem is, remember when we talk about morality, which I'll get to in a minute, there's a difference between good and bad and right and wrong. Right? Good and bad is a value term. So we say that that was good or that was bad. But right or wrong deals with a moral responsibility, doesn't it? What you ought to do. So even if you knew this standard, so what? Like, who's going to hold you accountable? Doesn't really matter, right? So and again, as we go through this, I want you to think about this when you like discourse with your friends, because we're going to talk about all of like the hot button issues like homosexuality and all that sort of stuff. Because I mean, it's just, we got to deal with it, right? So you have to remember, when we're talking about the objective subjective, and go back to all the stuff we talked about with the laws of logic and all that sort of thing, remember that if this is true, then everything else is false. But if you don't want to have something be objectively true, if you want to be a moral relativist, then you can't condemn this. You see what I'm saying? So you can't say that that's hateful for you to say this, or you can't, because by whose standard? There is no standard. This is all just made up, right? So in other words, and by saying that this position is wrong and my position is right, remember that's the law of non-contradiction.
Because they have the same.
So you're saying that there is a right and wrong, and your position is the wrong position, and my position is the right position. But you can't do that if you're a relativist, because they're all right. You see what I'm saying? So you can't, like, this stuff is it seems commonsensical when I talk, like if I say it to you, like right now. But if you're in a conversation with somebody, and I've been in these conversations where they're just like, well, I believe that, you know, everybody's free to do whatever, and I'm offended by you who think that somehow that your position is the only position that's acceptable, and how dare you impose your beliefs on other people and all that sort of stuff. What are they doing? They're saying you're wrong, but I'm right. Like, you should be like me. You should hold my beliefs and my opinions because those are the right positions. You see that? So they're doing the very same thing that they're accusing you of. They just don't see it, right? So, all right.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice, you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to then is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
I wonder if that one guy has a debunking of this video too.
Yeah, he does. Maybe we can do that.
You can get mad at him even more.
Yeah.
Debunk the debunk.
Debunk the debunk.
See how he goes against that.
Okay. So, actually, I couldn't figure out how to log into, when I go to get into the Gmail thing on this computer, it automatically goes to the,
Wait, you might want to share your screen again.
oh yeah, sorry.
Are you still sharing? Did you stop sharing?
I think that little box.
All right. So I think it's always helpful to, like, if we go back, and you don't need to turn there because I have it on the screen, but the one part I think that makes this such a tricky issue is the fact that everybody is like everybody has a moral sense. So when you talk to people, they'll be like, I don't need to believe in God to know what's right and wrong. I agree. Like, there's no conflict there. Why do we need to go to this and then they'll say, like, well, you know, if this is your standard of, like, oftentimes atheists in debates will be like, oh, like, if the 10 Commandments is your starting point, like, right off the bat, I could make it better in like 3 different ways, super easy. Like, this is your God who commands the killing of the Canaanites, men, women, and children. This is your moral standard. They say things like that, right? But again, the problem is, like, you're judging that by what standard? See, like, immediately, if you want to stand in judgment of God, like, where are you getting the standard from to even make that accusation? Like, you have no standard. So like, at best, you can just say everybody can do whatever they want to do and nothing's wrong with it. That's the best you could say. But the problem is that you know that's not true. That's what they're saying by objective moral values and duties do exist. We all know this. And that's why again, it leads you to God. If there is such a thing, then there's got to be some foundation for it. Where did these things come from? And that's why it says, like I have up here in Romans chapter 2, it says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, so they didn't have the law and the prophets and Moses and all this sort of stuff, right? But it says they do instinctively the things of the law. So you know that you should ultimately treat your neighbor as yourself and all that sort of stuff. Like you shouldn't just go like beat people up or do bad things to them. Like, we all know that, right? He says, not having a law are a law to themselves in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them on the day according to my gospel. Yeah, so on. But the point is, everybody, God has put a conscience in our heart. Now, if you get into, like at the end of my class, I talked about the Holocaust and all that sort of stuff. And if you read Friedrich Nietzsche and stuff, he said that the conscience was and Hitler said this too in Mein Kampf, that the conscience is a Jewish blemish. In fact, I think I mentioned this before, I took this class at Lehigh called Diversity and Multicultural Awareness, something like that. And literally the professor in the class, one night, he was like, get rid of guilt. You shouldn't feel guilty about anything. Anything you do, you shouldn't feel guilty about it at all. Like, that's an amazing statement, isn't it? But at the same time, this is the irony of the whole thing. At the same time, he's teaching the whole class that we should be respectful of everybody's different positions and that racism's wrong and that we should be, you know, gender inclusive and sexually inclusive and all these types of things. It's like, what if you're not? Should I not feel guilty about that? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, you can't have it both ways, but that's what you want. Like, that's what they want. They want to like have their cake and eat it too. So again, kind of to rehash what we've talked about, this is the third of the 4 fundamental questions. Why am I the way that I am, and how should I be? And ultimately, as we go through this, I want you to keep this in mind, because this is, again, when I end my class at school, I go through the whole argument for the Holocaust, and I talk about how evolution plays into it. And again, people will deny this vehemently, but if you read Mein Kampf, it's there, right? Hitler talks about the degradation of the races and how it's not just the outward appearance, but the inner appearance, the culture of man. And he essentially says that if you took the Germans and put them anywhere, they would have thrived, because it's the inner culture of the German people, and that's why they were the most highly educated, sophisticated people in the world, and therefore we had to preserve the German race, and that's like the whole thing. It's all Darwinian if you read it. Like, it's all, and again, I have stuff in my class. I show them that even in World War I, the Germans were doing this. They were like liquidating people down in Africa, who they thought were just like a step above the apes and things like that, right? So like, all that is, you can verify all that. It's not a matter of speculation. So I show them that piece, and then we read some stuff from Nietzsche, and Nietzsche essentially was the guy Did I read the parable of the madman in here? The beginning? Yeah. So he's the guy that wrote that. And remember what I said? The whole point of the parable was that if there is no God, remember those 4 fundamental questions. If there is no God, then we got here by time plus chance plus matter. There's no meaning or purpose to your life, really. It doesn't matter how you behave. Like Richard Dawkins said, there's no, at the bottom, there's nothing but pitiless indifference. Which again, if you read Richard Dawkins' books, he does nothing but criticize and attack religion for being immoral. Like he said, God is, like, you ever see that clip where he's like, God is the malevolent bully, megalomaniacal, filicidal, genocidal, all this, yeah.
Homophobic, whatever.
But if there's nothing but pitiless indifference, what are you even talking about? Right?
Who are you to say?
So there is no good, bad, right, or wrong. He said that himself. So how are you standing in judgment against God? By what standard, right? So, and then when you die, nothing happens. So I tell the kids, like, ultimately, like Hitler said, I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, pitiless, relentless, and cruel. And Nietzsche said the same thing. And ultimately, I said, if you were at the Nuremberg trials and the Nazis said, look, we were just following orders, this was the rules, these were the laws, we were doing what we're told to do, you can't come in and say that we were wrong after the fact, you know, who are you to sit in judgment on us? If we won the war, we could do the same thing to you. And they really said that. And I said, if you were the prosecuting attorney, what would you say? I said, what if the Nazis killed everybody? Imagine if the Nazis won World War II and they killed everybody that disagreed with them. Would the Holocaust still be wrong?
Well, yeah, it would still be wrong.
Yes. But the kids at school are like, no. I'm like, yes. And they're like, and then they're always like, the answer that I always get is like, well, I don't like it, but who am I to say that they're wrong, right? And I'm saying, but see, there's the trick. Why don't you like it? That gives the game away, doesn't it? I said, what if you were one of the guards at Auschwitz and you were unloading people off the train? You could convince yourself that this is ultimately for the betterment of humanity, that we're driving evolution forward by getting rid of all the people who aren't fit to reproduce, and it's social Darwinism, right? Like, let's have the Germans dominate the world. And Hitler said this, like, once the Germans take over, you can still have other people, but you just limit their breeding because you need them to do certain things, right? But what happens in nature is that if you let the unfit reproduce without any hindrance or limit, that they'll soon overwhelm the good, like the strong, right? So like he says, nature automatically filters those people out. But we, because of, he calls it Jewish nonsense, because you want to help the poor and the weak and all that stuff, you actually allow them to reproduce, and that's going to end up ruining any chance of human evolution advancement, because the poor and the weak people will so greatly outnumber the strong people that it will doom us all. That was their logic, right? And again, if there's no God, that makes sense, doesn't it? If we just got here by evolution, then that makes sense. And so it's kind of like, it's not a pleasant thing to do, but 1,000 years from now, by killing all these people off, the human race will look back at the Nazis and say like, wow, you did a good thing. That's great. Thank you. But I'm like, but imagine if you're the guard, would you feel the same way if it was your family on the train? You'd be like, okay, kids, listen, this is for the betterment of humanity. You guys go in this line. Mom and I are going to go over here, and just we're doing our part, right? Love you. Wow. Of course not, right? Of course not. And so like you can see the conflict because the kids are like, and then it goes back to, remember we did the objective subjective thing, right? You know, I say all those things and they all get them right, and I'm like, sexual abuse is wrong. Objective or subjective? And they're like, subjective. Really? What? Well, some people, like, well, then they're wrong. Right? That's like, if that was you being abused, would you be like, well, that's just their opinion, so who am I to say? Like, no, of course not, right? Of course not. And that's why when it comes down to it, remember we said the test for truth. You have to connect these things, right? So the test for truth, remember we said the correspondence test for truth is can you live consistently with this being the case? So is it possible to live consistently, logically consistently, if there is no such thing as good, bad, right, or wrong? And I don't think you can. And so if that's true, then there must, like, morality must be real. It must be objectively real. And then, like, then you have to ground it, which is where we'll pick up next up. Does that all make sense? All right, we should stop. So let's close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for the time that we have to think about these things. Some of these things are a little difficult, Lord, but we pray that you would help us as we struggle through them to understand them, and then to be able to make sense of these things so that we can explain it to other people in a very clear way, in a loving way, as we've talked about, but to show them that there really is a good, bad, and right or wrong. And these things are all grounded in you and your nature, and that you are good. You are the good. And you demonstrated that ultimately through the Lord Jesus Christ, who it says that he is the exact representation of you, Lord. And we look at him and we just marvel at his kindness and his goodness and his humbleness. But also, Lord, we know that you are holy and that you are long-suffering, but you are just, and that there is a judgment that does await us. And so while you've offered forgiveness, that there is a time, it says it's appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. So we pray that we would be bold in sharing your love for people so that they can accept you today before it's eternally too late. So we just pray these things and pray that you would help us in these things. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.